Let's do it.
All right, I am here with Pete Sena. Thank you for joining me on the Polymaths podcast. Please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hey, Innovators audience, what's going on? Thanks for having me, Dustin. Really appreciate you being here.
Yeah, thanks for being here.
Hello and welcome to the Polymath Polycast.
So starting off strong, you seem to be quite the futurist with your mind towards what it can be while still holding on to what it is now. What sort of changes do you see happening over the next 10 years?
Yeah, wow, 10 years. I mean, Dustin, it's a really great question. I've been thinking about it a lot. And obviously with everything that's happening right now with COVID, I think we're going to see some huge behavioral shifts. So for me, I sort of like to look at it like really big picture, right? So like as a futurist, like we both have these really wild and, animated imaginations, right? They're always going. So I always think about, okay, what's going to be transformed and then actualized essentially over time. So, when I think about it, just fast forward 10 years or even later, I think we're going to continue to see things speed up, right? Specifically with the way that, mankind and machines work together. So we do a lot of work in smart, so IoT, Industry 4.0. So I think we're going to continue to see like cobots, robots, different augmented or further selves. So like what I mean by that specifically is like, I think 10 years from now or less, we're going to see our reliance on the cloud, I think, be a much bigger part of how we achieve self-actualization, right? So everything from maybe it's going to be the proliferation of advanced connectivity. So I think like 5G is certainly going to be, whether we, legislative fights it off or not on a global scale, I think the faster that we're able to move information, the more that we can connect. I think we're going to see, like Elon Musk was just talking about on his Joe Rogan podcast episode, I'm sure, did you catch that one?
Not yet. I've been hearing about it though.
It's a long episode, but basically, he talks about how we're going to be, brain implants and Neuralink and that sort of thing. So I don't believe it's far-fetched to think that 10 years from now, the relationship that we have between these things is certainly going to be sped up. So I think we're going to see a lot more, everything with the word tech attached to it. So health tech, med tech, ed tech. I think just in general, what we're going to start to see is this idea of, especially now with COVID over the next, I think, 2 to 4 years, we're going to see lots of things that we never thought about. So worlds within worlds. I think we're going to see a different way of the virtual self, right? So like what I mean by that specifically is like, if we learn anything from like what Marshmallow did on Fortnite and these different games within games, I think you're going to start to see people taking an elevated level of self, right? So things like biohacking, augmented self, much more experimentation with psychedelics. I think if we look at just the legislation, right. I think we can see a lot of things different changing there. But ultimately, Dustin, I think, everyone's going to be looking to speed up their brain and to deepen their experiences. And what I mean by that is how we connect, consume, and ultimately create, I think is going to continue to be accelerated. Just this past week, we saw that the head of streaming media for Disney has now gone over to be the CEO of TikTok. What we can see there is a fundamental shift in just the global culture and this idea of people thinking, while they might be acting more local, they're going to be acting more global at the same time. So I think what that means is that we're going to see people shopping, entertaining themselves very differently. I don't think it'll be, strange. Like, for example, a year ago, there was that big trend where people in Asia were marrying robots. Just as like a big thing that we see on the internet, whatnot. But I don't think it's going to be weird to go on a virtual VR vacation in 2 years or less. I think right now people need an escape. And some of the best ways to escape now is on a two-dimensional rectangle. So I think that we're going to start to see lots of different things with how we connect with technology really starting to change. And certainly 10 years from now, there's going to be a lot more data lakes that have natural language processing, learning models on that. So I think the way we can communicate with machines will be a lot closer to Jarvis and Iron Man than it is today with Alexa just saying, "Did you mean open this skill?" So that's sort of, I think voice tech is going to get sped up. I think different types of sensors, I think, will certainly get accelerated. I don't know if in 5 years from now we'll start to see, more than half the population with implants that are making them faster, better, smarter. But I do think within the next 20 years, I'm a huge steward of Kurzweil's work. So I think that if we look at some of the things he's presented, I think we can definitely see some things. But those are some of my big things. I think overall, thematically, it's more human, more connected. And I mean that both from how we lead, how we connect, how we create. I'm really inspired by like a lot of the sort of less dystopian tech is something that, especially the past couple months with COVID, I've been really I've been pulling back on like looking at Proteus and Google and all their ingestible sensors and implants, just simply because I think while I love to muse on those things, what I'm really, really excited about right now is just behavioral economics and understanding how can we start to connect differently. I mean, just think of the relationship that you and I are having right now in the audience where, we've just connected. That probably wouldn't have been possible, 3 to 5 years ago. Right. The technology was there, but the behavioral change wasn't. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I can go deeper if you'd like, but that's what shows up for me is, don't get me talking too much because I'll start talking about augmented consciousness.
And I think that with the whole premise of just augmentation, even just in a micro sense, like with nootropics, the mental supplements, that's already been a big thing in Silicon Valley. It's been a big thing in my life. I actually chose to work at Natural Grocers, like basically health food store, so I could get a 30% discount on supplements, and I was able to try out a whole bunch.
Super smart, yeah.
And you're talking about augmentation and biohacking, and I think that too, there's going to be that change of like, there's been that contact lens that can be
absolutely
like a VR experience, that kind of thing. It's very interesting seeing where we're going, and especially like how you said, the non-dystopian kind of tech, the more you take.
Absolutely, yeah. We've all seen that like Hyperverse video that came out a couple of years ago. It's like a little bit overwhelming. Dustin, what I think is really interesting is like, you mentioned the contact lens. One of the places that I get a lot of my inspiration from, like most futurists, is obviously science fiction movies, of course, and the like, but also digging into patents, right? So I think, if we look at whether it be, the smart goggles or smart lenses, like you mentioned, a lot of these patents or provisional patents are being filed, right? So we can dig in. This is freely available information. So if I was to launch any business right now, again, I've launched too many, so I got to keep up with the ones I have. But if I was to launch anything, I would really work to use machine learning to analyze patents as they're being filed. And what I would do with that is I would analyze that data for some emotional cognition. So for those of you that might be listening to this that are really, really good when it comes to natural language processing or meaning making through language, I would argue that using machine learning, we can sort of look towards the future by really analyzing the present at a much more hyper level. So that's something I would offer up for the audience. Just it's something that is may or may not be being worked on by some folks that I'm connected with, but more on that at another time.
Yeah, I'll have you back on the show. And if anyone's listening who's going to do that, hit me up and I'll talk to you about it. Yeah, that's crazy because like the patent system's actually pretty flawed. There's always humans going through it, and oftentimes they often miss stuff, and it takes forever for a patent to really go through, as you probably know, even more than me at this point. But it's interesting how if we were to use machine learning and even just AI in general, like a small little script to kind of go through and kind of organize it better, I think that it would make a big difference.
Absolutely.
And kind of diving into the questions here, because you said all those different businesses you were mentioning, is that like, you have what, Think FWD and Holberton School, digital surgeons, all these different avenues of your attention. How are you able to split your attention evenly?
Well, I think the first thing that I would say is that I have an incredible and amazing team. I'm blessed in that I surround myself with just really driven, focused folks, and I'm blessed with that. So I think, again, any innovator worth their salt, and I certainly wouldn't say I'm worth my salt yet, but give me some time. I would say it comes down to just the team they surround themselves around. The era of the giants like Steve Jobs, where it was about one leader or one person, I think that's behind us now. I think the next 100 years is going to be about how people can innovate and collaborate compassionately in a team. So to that end, I think the first thing is just surround yourself with a great team. I wish I learned that sooner, Dustin, to be honest. Leadership was something that didn't come easily to me because as a self-taught designer and engineer, where I'm most comfortable is, in a terminal. So, or in a design software. So I think that's one thing. The other thing I think is just really, I have a endless supply of curiosity. And I'm going to talk with you a lot about that. I think a lot of your questions that might come up today, I would imagine I might be defaulting to that. But really, I mean that. Curiosity is a really big one for me because if you don't love what you're doing, you're going to burn out. And I think, the kind of hours that I keep are, just for example, Dustin, this past weekend, I was doing shader development for a sort of augmented reality experience that I've been flirting with lately that sort of brings together digital and physical in a different way. And it's just been a side hustle of mine because I don't get to do much of that in my day job. Right. And, I was joking around with one of my friends, and he's like, that's how you spend your weekends? And I'm like, yeah, dude, like that's what I love to do, So for me, I would say surround yourself with the right people first and foremost. Understand your purpose and where you're going, and then just make sure that you're always, tapping into that curiosity. Those are the sort of big things for me that work.
Yeah, definitely. And I've been hearing more and more about having a strong team and making sure you're able to have people basically pick up your slack kind of thing. If there's some area that you're not good at, having someone who can do it for you and kind of delegate it to is super important.
Yeah, I don't think it's, not to correct you, but just to jump in, I think it's less about slack and more about understanding all the fulcrums and elevation points of the business, right? So for example, if you've got a business that's very tech driven, you really need people who are human centric or operation centric. So I think one of the things that entrepreneurs are not often very good at is balancing the different things because of they know how to do 200%, but not 10%. So I think that having that balance is really important because to your point, if you're pulling on too many things at once and there is no slack, right, to use your metaphor, it's hard to do. So yeah, no, same page for sure.
How can someone cultivate curiosity then?
I love that. I think that's a tough question because I really believe that we're all born super curious. So one of the things that we do in a lot of our innovation workshops with our clients is we don't teach them how to innovate, we remind them how to innovate. What I mean by that specifically is there's a lot of science, Dustin, around after the age of 5 and then 9, there's actually an exponential decline in the number of times people ask the why question. So I think curiosity is something that if we lose sight of it and we don't practice it, like any muscle, like going to the gym or working out, we lose it. So I would say the way that you cultivate curiosity is by asking questions, is by understanding and challenging. I hate that cliche challenge the status quo, but I think why is this bottle in this plastic? Why isn't it in something else? Unfortunately, right now, I don't usually like to drink plastic bottles. I usually like to drink them out of glass, but I happen to be doing that. So sorry for the environment today. I'm usually much better, so don't get me in trouble. But in all seriousness, I think always inquiring into a deeper sense of why and what could be. So I always say, why, what if, what ought to be, what could be, why not. These are sort of language frames that I think are really, really important to be able to bring a lot of that stuff to life.
Yeah, definitely. And kind of ripping off that why thing, one of the classes I took last year in school was talking about the 5 whys. And so
yeah, love that.
Why over and over again to really distill what's causing that situation to occur.
Totally. Yeah, no, I appreciate that.
One of my heroes, Leonardo da Vinci, kind of still going off that idea of curiosity. One of his hallmark principles is curiosity, or curiosita, as you would say. But what sort of things do you think we could do to learn from him?
Oh, well, for one, I think the thing we can learn is if you look at any great innovator or any great athlete or any of those types of things, they all cross-train, right? So years ago, football players were doing ballet to become, more balanced and flexible. I think that what any polymath knows, and it takes one to know one, so I appreciate you being here with us and bringing me to this thing, is I really think exploring a multitude of different things is really one's ability to sort of get into it. So for me, like, how do you tap into curiosity? Language, inquiry, and experimentation, right? So like what Leonardo did so well, if again, we've studied him, right, is he had this wild imagination, but a rapid focus on experimentation, right? So like he probably should have been the godfather of design thinking, not made famous by Simon Hubert or IDEO, right? He really should have been that person because he taught us what it meant to do design thinking, to connect unconventional things. I tell people a lot, Dustin, I pride myself on the ability to solve ordinary problems unconventionally, right? And like being able to think that way allows linear thinking to be made exponential, right? Or essentially that idea of 2 + 2 = 5, right?
Yeah, definitely. And kind of going into that whole user experience or this design experience in general, your whole kind of world is really kind of revolved around that innovation, that experience, and understanding how not only people think, but how you can create awesome experiences for people and to really innovate the changes that occur from that. So speaking of like UI, for example, I went on your personal brand website. It's phenomenal, by the way.
Oh, thanks so much.
I've been trying to work on like building a modern interface with my own site, and just being on your site just a few times gave me like ideas and really challenged the way I thought about web design. And I thought that was really cool.
Oh, I really appreciate that. It was a lot of fun to work on, and definitely had some great collaborators that I was able to team up with. I mean, I think for me, in order to be able to bring certain things to light, I think collaboration is super, super critical. So I'm always on the hunt for, just passionate people who can think both like me, but also unlike me. And I think that's a really, really key thing, is that being able to sort of look at something from a big picture and then a small picture, it makes it really easy. So, I appreciate you saying that. I think, how I got to a lot of that thinking was just through what are some of my favorite patterns for telling stories, and like, how can I be as simple as possible? To be frank, that was one of my most challenging sites I've ever designed or been a part of designing. And I had a lot of help with it simply because I sat down, and designing for yourself is really, really hard. It's really easy for me to design for some of these big global brands that I work on with my teams. But when you're staring at a photo of yourself, you're like, oh, I hate that. It's tough. And I think a lot of that comes down to just, my own challenges, which we'll, I'm sure, get into, knowing where you're going to poke and prod. So,
yeah. Well, what inspires you to design it that way?
In terms of that process?
Yeah, that process and just the overall end result.
Yeah, no, I love that. So I think, the first thing I was trying to do is, by creating that, is I was getting a lot of people that were reaching out to me or my team, specifically looking to have me, do a keynote speech or a trends forecast or a workshop or whatever it was. And I didn't have anywhere to send them that was relevant or outside of one of the many companies that I'm privileged enough to be a part of. And, one of the things I was saying is like, what are the top 5 things that people keep asking for? So I went to my team, and my team sort of made a list. They said, okay, out of, a couple hundred requests in the past year, people are looking for these things. So that was a very easy UX exercise to say, okay, from a user experience perspective, we need to communicate these 5 things, these 3 things. What do I want the audience to think, feel, and do, right? So naturally, for me as a creative technologist, what needed to be really present was that sort of mix of design and technology, right? So I made some very deliberate decisions as to how do I want to showcase that content in a way that, from a design system perspective, was the foundational UI that we established at Digital Surgeons, but also created an extension and a modularity to that brought the art direction a little bit of a twist, right? So one of my favorite colors is blue. It's specifically because, blue to me is nature, it's sky, it's a lot of different things. So there's a spiritual component. I also happen to be really into a water element, if you look at my Chinese sign. So for me, blue was really over-indexing as a color I wanted to bring about. It shows me possibility in sort of open field, if you will. So that's how the art direction came to be. And then just from a UI perspective, I found myself just using a lot of really tried and true basic UI patterns. I didn't want to go with any cumbersome UX that was going to be like, some overdone WebGL experience or something that was just like, felt like a Flash site from 10 years ago. I mean, as much as I love doing those types of experiences and I have for our customers, I just wanted something simple that if you're 14 or 55 and anywhere in between, if you come to the site on your mobile phone or your tablet or your desktop, you can experience it. You can see what, who I am, what I am. One of the best compliments I've gotten so far, outside of the one you shared, so thank you for that, was my young nephew who's, in high school was like, Uncle Pete, that thing's really cool. Like when I'm moving around, like your face is doing that cool thing. And like,
yes.
So it was just, that was a great thing, because I think part of the magic of what we do, and, I sort of put you in the same circle as where I play, is the magic is in delivering these things to someone who doesn't understand that's unexpected, right? I show that to one of my friends who's a designer or developer. He's gonna look at it and go, oh, that's a basic pixel sorting chromatic aberration effect. There's 100 places you can steal that from with JavaScript or CSS. But when I see, what lights me up is when a person who doesn't know how the magic happens, you show the magic. That to me is why I do what I do every day, is that it's about bringing about that magic. So sometimes I think it's looking within and saying, okay, what are the basic things I have to have? What are the questions I have to answer? Why am I making this site? And then that really made the decisions really easy in terms of working with my team to help me bring that to life.
Yeah. And one of the things you're even saying too about the whole creative technologist, I like that term right there, is that it already implies balance. So one of my key principles in life is balance, specifically between like philosophy and science. There's a lot of bridging between those two mediums. And I think that as a creative technologist yourself, I think you understand that as well.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you saying that. I honestly, Dustin, I strive to achieve balance. Balance is something I really struggle with. I don't know how to do anything in moderation. It's something I'm spending a lot of time meditating on and working on. For me, I really strive for harmony, right? So harmony for me is about frequency, it's about resonance, it's about really getting on that wavelength. And it's inspiring to hear you say that one of your principles is balance. I should have you on a show that I'm working on right now, which I'll definitely have my team reach out to you on. I'd love to have you on because I just think you'd be a great guest. And, it's interesting that you say balance because for me, I feel like where I thrive is in the intersection.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite pieces of art is by Jackson Pollock. It's called Convergence. And I have a print of it at my house. Obviously it's a print. It's not a priceless anything. But what I like about that idea of convergence is it's that which can emerge when you combine disconnected things creates an extraordinary connection. That's what Leonardo did. That's what Tesla did. That's what Elon Musk is doing now with Tesla and SpaceX. Steve Jobs did with the iPhone. For me, it's that idea that intersecting these two things, it's where that Venn diagram comes together. That magic is really the wonder that comes between art and science, right? So that's what shows up for me. I think that's how we, really can strive to bring things together and solve problems in a different way.
Definitely. And I want to get into like the whole idea of a force multiplier, but I think before that, one thing that kind of your Venn diagram kind of explanation kind of sparked up was Ikigai, the Japanese concept for like the reason for being. And it's basically just the culmination of what you can provide to the world, what you can make money off of for financial supports, what you can enjoy doing, and what you can do without even just trying, basically, something you're good at. And I think
love that.
It's exactly kind of what you're thinking there too.
No, I appreciate that. One of the speaking gigs that I do a lot is called the UX of You. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of the presentation, hopefully I won't ruin it for those that might see it and haven't seen it yet, I talk a lot about Ikigai. And I actually dive into, I have a couple slides where I walk through mine. Mm-hmm. And then I have a couple of exercises. So there's a piece I'll definitely send you. I wrote an article, I think it was for HubSpot or one of the publishers that I write for, talking about how to sort of tap into ancient design thinking to find that. So I think what I love about, and have you read the book, Ikigai, like by chance?
No, I listened to the audiobook, but yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, it's literally like, if you look in the bookshelf, it's right there. I love that. But yeah, I'm a huge fan of Ikigai. Thank you so much for bringing that up. I think for me, where the intersection really lies is this idea of like unlocking possibility and purpose to drive things forward. And like, that's what I strive to do with everything I do. It's sort of the one thing that I think keeps me going, in crazy times for sure.
I was even talking to someone the other day about entrepreneurship and how with entrepreneurs, things are up and down, up and down, up and down. You really have to have that grit, or in this case, an Ikigai, a why, to push past those really crazy points.
Totally.
Speaking of like rearranging your room, something I've been doing ever since I was a child was just like taking my bedroom furniture and rearranging the feng shui of it to find a better flow of the room. And in the room I'm in now, I have like my bed and my two desks here, and I have a window there, a door there, and a closet here. And the actual flow of the room is so specific because you have so much, you can't cover those three spots. But I need to have something behind me, like you were saying, for your camera there. But I also need to be able to not have the bed in the shot. I don't want that in the shot. So just finding the balance of like, hey, how should I rearrange this room? And I've gone through 40 iterations of it. Crazy.
I love that. I'll have to connect with you in FaceTime or something and get some inspiration you have, because I'm getting a lot of crap from people to have a more interactive background, and Zoom just doesn't cut it with the sort of halo effect. So I'm either going to go all green screen and just do something really trippy out there with some lights, or need to just rearrange it. But yeah, no, for sure.
That bookshelf was really interesting. If you put that behind you and then face the windows, that natural lighting will help you. And then with the interesting bookshelf behind you, that might be pretty perfect.
Ooh, I love that. That's a great idea.
All right, diving right in, something you talk about being as a force multiplier. What does it mean to be one?
Wow. So you've done your homework. I definitely got to give you that. It's inspiring to talk to you on that. So I think, for me, at a simple level, what I would say a force multiplier is if you think about the idea of 2 + 2 equaling 5, right? So most people have 2 and 2 is 4. No. A force multiplier knows how to make 2 and 2 equal 5. So, I was in a meeting one time with a client, an executive from a pretty large brand we were working with, and he's like, Pete's a force multiplier. And I was like, it sounded so cool. I was like, this is either a crazy insult or a huge compliment. So I grabbed him after the meeting and I said, what the hell does that mean? And, he said to me, he explained to me that where it came from, and I dug into it. But ultimately, what a force multiplier is it's a combination of things that you can add where it essentially makes the sum of all the parts greater than the whole, right? So the term originally, as I understand it, comes from military science. And it basically talks about what are the different factors that when you combine them, allow you to basically accelerate at a rapid growth of change. So entrepreneurs, Peter Thiel wrote a book called 0 to 1, where he's talking about the idea, how do you think as a 10x thinker, right? Or exponential thinking, like Kurzweil talks about a lot. So for me, what it means to be a force multiplier is being able to combine things or add things or take things away through design that ultimately create a different, more powerful outcome. When I think about how do you become a force multiplier, I get that question all the time. And the answer for me is very easy. The answer is easy, but the work itself is hard, right? Which is you got to tap into your inner self. You got to tap into your own curiosity, your own Ikigai, as you were mentioning before, Dustin. And I think, for me, looking within, obviously you mentioned, why, start with why as an example, right? Like I think digging into why is something a certain way, understanding the principles that surround it, understand the system that it sits within. So, one of the things I teach all my employees, whether they're an intern or they've been doing this for 30 plus years, is you have to look at systems thinking. Yeah. You have to understand the principles of nature and emergence and design thinking. And that to me, it's what the Leonardos of our time knew about, right? They understood how to experiment and ideate. And, everyone talks about these great innovators, but they don't talk about the thousands and thousands of things that they've done just to get it right. It's like, how many thousands of times do you have to fail before you have the epic success? And I think that right now, I work with a lot of young people. So whether it be high school kids or college kids or young entrepreneurs, and I was once that person where it was like, I want to get there faster. Yeah. I want to shortcut it, right? I want to 10x it. But, I think people tend to not want to do the work. And there's this like illusion of entrepreneurship that I think we have out there. And people need to listen to these celebrity entrepreneurs that they're following. And if you listen to, the Mark Cubans of the world or the Gary V's or these very successful people, they tell you the answer. Yeah. The answer comes down to your work ethic. The answer comes down to going through the steps a million times over and over. We can learn that from the athletes. Like if you haven't watched The Last Dance, the documentary, whether you like basketball or not, you can understand why Jordan is Jordan. Yeah. You can understand why these people are at this different level. They didn't get there by, Sergey didn't get to Google by cracking open a book on programming and learning how to write an if statement and walking away. And then going and playing, Fortnite for 55 hours a week. He got there because he was really challenging. How do you think about search? And I think that that's the thing that people forget about is what do they have to do to get there? So that's what shows up for me, Dustin, when you ask about being a force multiplier. I think it's going through that sort of chaos loop over and over again. And just every time you go through it, learning one more thing that can ultimately level up your game.
Okay, there's a lot to digest there. That's actually fantastic of a way to explain it, I think. And it's interesting how some of the examples you used about like Google, for example, it's almost as if he saw a different system of way of doing things. He saw something that needed to be created in that way. And so let me pick your brain here then. I created a Modular Degree to be like a do-it-yourself self-education, so to speak. This modularity system, or even a skill tree based system in video games, where if you have a skill in a game, you would go down a skill tree, different different outlets of that tree will have different skills building on themselves and that kind of thing. And I took that idea, like, what if we had that idea for education? If you're in the middle of a class and you have a topic, let's say just some kind of mathematics, but for some reason this way of doing it is not working for you, you can go down a different skill tree, different branch of that skill tree to try to apply that knowledge. And then if you went back to that original branch, you'll have a different width of knowledge, that kind of thing.
I love that, Dustin. It's incredible how similar you and I are in terms of our passions. I was just on a call before this podcast with a leading university that I'm not going to name just because I want to protect their anonymity, how you use that word, but they were talking about how they want to reimagine education. And it's interesting to hear you say that because as a programmer and someone with an engineering background, I look at just how something like a Git repository is structured, branches, trees, forks, etc. And then as someone who's really passionate about just the video games is actually how I got into the world that I got into, right? I wrote an article a couple of years ago where I analyzed the Perk tree system in Fallout 4.
Oh.
And how that system, I think there's a roadmap inside that system. So I'm really intrigued to hear more about what you're doing, because I think that I love the idea of modularity and customization. I really believe that the world's greatest knowledge hasn't been unlocked yet, not because of Google or not because of these great techniques, YouTube, all these tools that we have at our fingertips, but because of learning modalities. So I think that you're onto something very, very sharp, and I'm like super intrigued to hear more about it.
Thank you. One thing we can also mention too is that the college that I went to last year for a short time, Foundry College, is developing some systems in place to change how online education works. And I think that having schools like that who are aiming to change how education is performing now, they opened up their platform, their video platform, Forge, to other universities. And I think that this almost open source mentality, or at the very least open learning mentality, is very important. And there's a website called classcentral.com where basically just collects all the different courses, MOOCs, and micro-credentials into this long list. And they have a unique position to share that knowledge, because they'll end up making a lot of compilation blog posts. I wanted to take that kind of idea of being able to have that list of courses and be able to pursue it in a more degree-like format. So I started my modular degree to pursue my own ideal career. And I think other people would want to do it for maybe pivoting careers, or perhaps they don't want to go to college, they want an alternative, especially during a time like this where people are stuck at home and a lot of their expensive degrees aren't necessarily as valuable as they once were in person. The modularity is important to emphasize for people to be like, hey, I don't feel like this particular pathway is working for me. This course is not working for me, at least not yet. Let me take a step back, try a different course, and then focus on continuous progress, either through a different skill tree or different course or whatever, and try to interleave what they're learning and repeat it too as well, but interleave between different subjects so that their brain is more engaged with it.
I love that. Dustin, what shows up for me, just the futurist in me looks at that and says, okay, one of the biggest struggles that I've seen in mentoring folks or helping lead or consult for companies, and I've done both and I'm doing both, is how do you know when you know, right? So the challenge is that I think most people, like I'm guessing you've come across the flow diagram a couple times, just knowing how curious you are. And for those that don't know about flow, it's this kind of optimal state that sits somewhere between boredom and anxiety, right? So what I think is particularly interesting is they always say growth happens at the edge of your comfort zone. One of the things that I've always struggled with, I'm teaching myself calculus and trig again right now, simply because I'm really inspired by some of the universal truths that just escaped me because I had really bad math teachers. And I'm not going to call them out by name and shame them here, but I think what's interesting to your point about skill tree is, I'm particularly curious to understand what is that, how do you measure for, Duckworth calls it the adversity quotient or grit, how she refers to grit. And I think what's interesting is, how do you know when to switch paths? What I think would be interesting is a self-autonomous learning system that, whether that be based on using one of the sort of mental modifiers, like we have all these technologies now that I think it's Muse, the former CEO of Evernote, I think started, where it's measuring brainwaves. I forget the names of them escape me, but this idea that how do we have sensors that can tell us once we're at that point, right? Because one of the challenges I see is people either give up too soon or too late.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately what that leads to is, guilt or shame or frustration or, just brain chemicals that aren't firing the way that we want them to. So I'm particularly curious, Dustin, is that something you've come across at all? Is just understanding, what I like about video games is they do a great job of really helping you realize you really need to level up your strength or you can't beat this boss. A good friend of mine is a creative director, worked on games like Halo, and he came up with a system called the Gamer's Way, which if you haven't interviewed him, you got to get him on your podcast. He's going to blow your mind. I'll personally introduce you.
Thank you.
And he talks a lot about sort of games and business and life. But I'm curious, from your perspective, have you seen that perk tree or that skill tree come to life in a way with your work that helps people identify when to fork or when to go in these different directions?
So I realized that I did not answer this question when I was recording with Pete. So I wanted to answer it now, post-recording. Whenever I experienced my own learning, I've had a natural inclination towards divergence. And so that divergence has really helped the skill tree-based learning that I've applied to my own education, my own modular degree. However, I've not necessarily experienced a true shift where I was like, hey, this is where I need to go down this path. I just ended up choosing a different one. So you gotta have a little bit of self-control, which I didn't have at the time, but I also knew what I needed to go to as well. So it's a little bit of self-awareness as well. So I haven't necessarily seen someone apply the skill tree-based learning in an official sense just yet. Thanks for asking a question, Pete.
Serendipity is calling.
Yeah. Right off the bat, I wanted to kind of mention the idea of flow again, because it's one of the things that really invested me into the idea of interleaving and repetition. So as a lifeguard, when I first started my first job, I guess I should say, my first job was a lifeguard. And as one, we had to maintain our focus on the zone of protection of the pool. And by doing so, we switch our zones every 30 minutes to keep that engagement of the brain. I don't know exactly who discovered that per se, but it was an interesting concept of you're basically changing where your focus was to keep it at an optimal state. Not necessarily flow, but at least in a more optimal. You were mentioning video games as well. And one video I was watching was talking about Resident Evil 4, where in this game, it has a dynamic difficulty. So if you end up going into an area like the village and start dying a lot or having a hard time killing the zombies, it would actually adapt the intensity, how many zombies were there, how fast they were moving, how much they would stand still based off of that. And if you're doing really well, they would increase the number and that sort of thing. And so it's interesting how if you were playing that game, you would enter the state of flow much more easily than, let's say, like even Halo or something like that, because it wasn't as dynamic. I think Halo's not a really good example. Halo's really dynamic, but it was just that kind of mentality. When it comes to the modular degree, I actually have a colleague who's talking about machine learning. I don't want to give too much of his information away per se, but he was talking about using AI in a way to analyze students' ability to understand the concept. Like if the student was able to enact the certain action that they were learning, the AI could tell if it was correct or not, much like a coach in real life. I was also thinking about how digital mentors is a big key aspect behind that too. So if I could build up the modular degree as an actual technical software, I would want to include the community aspect. So I think having peers who are in a similar boat to you, learning the same thing, they might know something that you don't know and vice versa. And that peer feedback would be very important, as well as mentorship of, even if it's just a slight, hey, this is 1 hour here and there, that might be helpful. And then of course, using AI in some sort of way.
That's what I love about Holberton School. I mean, obviously, one of the things that I'm working on is trying to change the face of technology jobs, right? And I mean that both from a gender perspective, from an ethnic status perspective, because, we don't need any more white guys in tech. We need more diversity. We need more, women and people of color in technology from different walks and talks and backgrounds. And I think what's interesting about what Holberton's doing, and, we were blessed enough to be able to open Holberton New Haven, which has started, of course, in San Francisco, is that they use machine learning in a bias-free interview process in terms of who they let in based on how determined you are. And what's particularly interesting is the entire curriculum, it's all peer-based learning. So I think, Dustin, you're really onto something here. And I would challenge you to continue to tap into your own curiosity, because I think that, there's a large part of me that feels that the problem with neural nets and machine learning, and I'd be happy to talk to your friend and nerd out with him, is that I think it requires a stimuli to train the system. But I think it's particularly interesting about elastic interfaces or dynamic interfaces in games is that they allow the feedback engine to be completely generated by the player itself, as opposed to based on the neural net or the model that would inspire that. So I think that, you know, the thing that shows up for me in that construct, which I think is really exciting, is how might we go about understanding and measuring the level of boredom, anxiety, frustration, and emotional responses. So where my mind goes is, you know, right now we both have cameras on us, right? There's a depth sensor in that Logitech Brio camera that I have. I know that because I was playing with it this weekend. And that depth sensor, you know, we can start to measure certain aspects in, you know, in using OpenCV or basic facial recognition. These are, you know, very easy technologies that are widely accessible. They've been around for a decade plus, and we can measure these things. So I wonder, how do we use those measurements to understand, you know, to your point, are we experiencing fatigue? Is that fatigue caused by boredom? Is that fatigue caused by just lack of sleep? You know, like, have I had too much Starbucks today and not enough water? So as a hydration level, I think what's interesting is learning systems, in my opinion, I hated college. I hated it, you know, because it didn't have the power of choice.
Yeah.
Right. Whether free will is a thing or not, we're not going to get into that because this can very quickly turn into a simulation conversation. But which I have plenty of times on any futurist I talk to. But yeah, no, I'm intrigued. I definitely would love to connect with you afterwards. And I don't want to sort of bogart your show, but yeah, this is interesting. There's some. I think you're onto something very provocative, and there's a lot of people out there I think who would happily indulge you financially to help you solve that problem.
Amazing. Yeah, I'll be happy to talk to you anytime. I think one thing that would be kind of good is to talk a little bit more about how one can innovate, because I think the idea of the modular degree is to be innovative in your own right for self-education, as well as just having an external source, so to speak. What do you think could be the source for someone becoming multi-talented or interdisciplinary? Because I think that's kind of how I really want the modular degree to evolve into, is to inspire people to pull from different pools of knowledge.
Yeah, I love that question, Dustin. You know, one of the things that shows up for me, I think the single greatest challenge that I face, or I have faced as a leader, as an entrepreneur, is understanding that at a systems level, we are all complex, adaptive organisms, right? And I think that the challenge with that is while we can be deduced to machine-like components, we don't operate like standard machines. And I think the challenge with that in terms of how we use that as a just awareness factor is figuring out how do we go from understanding motivation. So the thing I mentioned that's like has really kicked my butt quite a bit has been, how do you motivate people?
Yeah.
And how do you get people to want to learn? And the challenge is you can't motivate people. Motivation, true motivation, you know, it's like Daniel Pink talks about in his acclaimed book, Drive. You know, motivation is an intrinsic force that is really driven by purpose, autonomy, and mastery. And I think the challenge is that if you don't know what your purpose is, the worst question to ask someone is, what's your purpose? Yeah. Because you're going to just frustrate them because their loop is just going over and they're going to melt, right? Mm-hmm. So purpose is a challenging one. Autonomy is difficult because many of the systems that we know today are designed to create predictable, reliable outcomes, right? I learned that. I learned the sort of genesis of management from a brilliant mind in education named Al Bob, where he sort of explained to me this. And again, I'm happy to introduce you to all these people. They would love to talk to you. And Al is sort of explaining to me the concept of modern management was really based on an extrapolation of Taylorism, right? Which is this idea to create a modern day factory. But we're in the knowledge economy. So the challenge I've been frustrated with is, how do you motivate people? What I always think is, you know, when I meet people who are smart or talented, but they're not in a state of wanting to grow and evolve, that frustrates me. That drives me crazy because we have so many things available to us now that chasing mastery, whether that mastery is being the best streamer on YouTube or being the strongest woman or man in the world, whatever your end goal is less important to me. it's just to see people sort of leveling up and creating that progressive system. So I feel wholeheartedly that education has let us down. I think that society has let us down because it's created the wrong mental models on what it means to learn and what it means to be successful. And I think ultimately what that results in is we create these totems and these mental models in our constructs, our consciousness, that have us pointing to what does it mean to be successful? You know, does it mean having 5 million Instagram followers and you know, seemingly rich? Well, what does it mean to be rich, right? Like, what does it mean to lead? Like, are some of the mental models that we will have now for the next 20 to 50 years on what does it mean to be a leader, right? My mental model on leadership was broken because I watched too many 80s action movies.
Yeah.
You know, I thought you had to be this big buff, you know, tough guy to be, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger to be able to run the world. And unfortunately now, because of some of the bully behaviors that we see on TV, and I'm not going to name names, our mental models are adapting to that system because we're a complex adaptive organism in the system. So I think for me, what I'm particularly curious about is how do you take the best of an addictive video game, like that Resident Evil 4 game, great game by the way, and put that through that modular learning modality that you're talking about, Dustin. But for me, the one thing that's missing is the environmental and the experience that comes from it, right? So you mentioned peer-based learning, right? So what is it about peer-based learning that is massively successful? What is it about community that's massively successful? You know, we can look at all these models of civilization from Mesopotamia to ancient Greece to Silicon Valley to understand that the idea of collision of experience and information and collaboration leads to these epicenters of density, which I think the modern definition of density will change because of what we're dealing with this pandemic, right?
Right.
How do you bring about that density? So it's a particularly provocative discussion for me, Dustin, because I think the work that you're doing right now, even with this podcast, I think is poking into a level of curiosity I don't think a lot of people are. So kudos to you, and I'm really excited to see, you know, just the shoulders of the giants that you're going to be able to stand on as a result of it.
Very much appreciate that sentiment. And I'm thinking that when it comes down to it seems like your biggest problem that you're facing was the ability to motivate people. And I think that's very related to the modality that you're talking about for the modular degree. And so kind of going back to something we mentioned earlier, to start with why from Simon Sinek, some of the greatest people like Steve Jobs and even Leonardo da Vinci were able to almost motivate people through that why. And I think that in order to find someone's passion or find someone's why, there definitely needs to be a level of self-awareness and meditation and self-introspection, that sort of thing. But I think it could be kind of pushed out through peers. So almost in this conversation itself, we're both getting more and more excited through the conversation evolving. And it's causing us to expose more of our whys to each other and understand each other on a deeper level. And I think the people listening will agree to that sentiment as well. So I think it's just a matter of understanding what the leader's why is and spreading that and storytelling it is a very crucial aspect. I think storytelling, there's actually a really good TED Talk, The Magic of Storytelling, I think, and I can send that to you later.
It's a great one. I love that.
Yeah. And combining that with the neurochemicals, the oxytocin and the serotonin, all the if you can enter those chemicals into people's brains through speech and storytelling, conveying that why, I think that's the real key to that.
Totally. No, I love that. I definitely agree.
All right. So kind of going back to the balance idea, and I think that really kind of fits into what we're talking about too. There's an interesting dichotomy between innovation, or I guess you could just say analysis of innovation and creativity. But what do you think it takes to find that balance?
I think a rapid experimentation. You know, one of the things that shows up for me is obviously the sort of lizard brain in us is prone to, our brain's job is to keep us alive in so many ways, right? So I think that, while a saber-toothed tiger is not going to jump up and kind of attack us right now,
right,
I think that fear is the thing that keeps us alive but also holds us back, right? So I think energetically, you talk about it, is like our mirror neurons are firing right now relating to one another. Chemicals are firing even virtually because now we're able to connect this way. And I think to answer your question on innovation, it has to be about the energy and the environment that you create to be able to innovate. You know, one of the things I've noticed, and I had this conversation recently with my leadership team from one of my companies, is I said to my team, I feel like we have slowed down our innovation curve. And this happened just before COVID, so it wasn't COVID, which obviously has forced many of us to innovate. You know, 6 years of digital transformation in 3 months, I think the stats said. But moreover, I think the point that I've been sort of positing to folks and really inquiring into is like, well, what slows down an innovation curve, right? You know, if you ask 10 people, one of the favorite things that I do when I'm interviewing teams before I do workshops is I interview them separately, or I have one of my facilitators do that. And I like to understand, how safe is it to fail in the organization? And I myself have learned from this. I've made millions of mistakes that I'm still recovering from because of my inadequacies as a leader and my naivete as a leader. Is if it's not safe to fail, it's not safe to experiment. If it's not safe to experiment, you can't create novel value, which essentially creates innovation, right? So I think the ability to create sustainable, repeatable innovation comes down to one's ability to, as Simon Sinek said, deeply understand the why, right? So any design thinking or innovation process or whatever buzzword you want to throw at it, they're all deeply related to what John Boyd, the fighter pilot, refers to as the OODA loop, right? So observe, orient, decide, and act. That loop, that construct of how do we look at and constantly challenge that as we go back through those loops, that I think is massively critical for innovation. If we're not experimenting, if we're not trying new things and learning from them, it's so easy to get caught in the status quo. And I say that, Dustin, because like I've watched myself do it a million times. I've watched my companies and my clients do it a million times, because when you come from nothing, and again, I wouldn't say I came from nothing, I was privileged, but didn't have some of the toys I have today, like the fancy computing devices that we have and all these fancy things and Teslas and all kinds of things, right? I don't want to lose those things. I don't want to go back to, you know, barely being able to afford a computer and not being able to afford all these fancy cloud technologies, Zoom and this and that. So I think the challenge is that fear is in us all, right? And when the risk factor seemingly exceeds the reward factor, innovation halts. It stops like a train, right? And I think for me, creating innovation is not about creating inspiration, because many of us have inspiration. I think it's about creating a sustained environment of observation that leads to iteration and exploration. And that to me is my personal secret, in my experience, how I continue to innovate. And also, just as you mentioned, meditation earlier, right? Or Ikigai, or some of these concepts that are, you know, I would argue spirituality is an API we haven't simply learned how to command yet. It's a technology we haven't learned how to wield yet. You know, there was a time when steam and fire was magic. And now these are things that we use every single day. So I think for me, innovation is, we have to find it ourselves, but those are the principles that I preach and I practice on a daily basis that I think help me, my teams, my clients kind of get unstuck when they get stuck.
Mind blown right there. I tell you that much. And it's interesting how, kind of going back to the balance idea too, one thing you said there that kind of just went off, kind of just under the radar there, is the API of spirituality, and how that idea is that spirituality really is something that could be reached out to multiple people. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a religious thing either.
Totally love that. Love that you said that. Say that again, because your audience needs to hear that.
Yes. So spirituality doesn't need to be a religious thing. It could be something with the connection with the subconscious and the bridge between the conscious mind and subconscious minds. And one thing I think that you're going to love is that this philosophy I cultivated called the 4 pillars. There's 4 major aspects of life: the mind, the body, spirit, and emotions. And how those areas impact you is very dynamic for one, but impactful. It's very deep. And so when one area is neglected or overly trained, can actually be a negative. So those two extremes, so to speak. If you focus too much on the body, not enough on the mind, let alone spirituality, it's going to negatively impact your emotions. And emotions itself is kind of a API between all 4 of them, basically. But it's interesting how these dualities and dichotomies come together.
That's awesome. No, I definitely, I feel like my team and I need to dig a lot more into some of the work that you're doing, because it's, you know, I can see us doing some interesting things together. I think the way that you're thinking about the body mind, as Deepak Chopra refers to it in his sort of concept of meta consciousness or meta self. I think I forget the name of it. Meta self, or what's he called? I know I just saw him speak. It was really incredible. I was grateful that he came here locally in Connecticut. I was able to see him before this whole COVID thing hit. So he's just next level guy. But yeah, no, this is interesting stuff. This is the stuff that keeps me getting out of bed in the morning. Is it's so interesting that you picked up on some of my sensibilities around user experience or user interface. For me, I feel like I'm simply trying to use my own lack of balance in understanding the human condition to sort of solve that through technology or design. And it's interesting, like I often find that the people that are solving some of the world's greatest problems or technology problems don't understand humans.
Yeah.
And I myself belong to that camp for a very long time. We look at like this guy starts a social network because he doesn't have friends and goes on to connect billions of people, Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook, right? Like we look at these people who are seemingly running away from a problem or running away from a struggle, from Leonardo to, the greats of the Renaissance to Steve Jobs, battling the fact that he was, seemingly abandoned, right, as a child, right? I think that this unique mix of struggle meets curiosity, I think when they come together, really unlock something like you're talking about. But I love this idea of these 4 pillars, because I think that there's the simplification of these complex concepts is something that I think I really wish all of us learned. It's like we all had sex ed in science and history, but like where did they teach us about spirituality from a non-denominational factor? I mean, like I would be all in on that class, I probably would think about the idea of sine, cosine, and tangent a lot differently if instead of just showing me triangles, they said, did you know that the frequency and the wave of your song and this favorite sound is no different than the frequency and the wave of your body's ability to sort of get back into circadian rhythm and go to sleep? If they drew that concept or that metaphor and they said, go down this skill tree, and they used a system that you designed, I think that I would probably be a whole lot better at math.
Yeah, same.
And
it kind of reminds me of the Fibonacci sequence, what you said.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, absolutely. Pi and Fibonacci and all these different things, like they're all around us, right? Some of the best, I started my career doing a lot of animation, design, interactive content. And, one of the things that I think made me a really good animator back in the day was just understanding, I remember Robert Penner's easing formulas and being able to look into that. And I said, okay, what's the closest thing to that? And I was blessed enough to be talking to an engineer who said to me, if you want to learn about how these formulas work, just go outside.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Today we know that concept as biomimicry, the study of nature around us, but I was just watching butterflies and hummingbirds and just different things and looking at the way they moved, and they didn't move like this, right? They moved like this. So understanding that movement and the fluidity of that to me, I would say, one thing I didn't mention, I want to double back on is innovation. Is I think the ability, one of our core values at Digital Surgeons, my marketing innovation company, is what we call adapt and respond. I think it's really, really critical, especially now, Dustin, where we have all these things that are seemingly broken. Society is seemingly broken, or education, or now the healthcare system because of everything with COVID. And again, special thanks to everyone that's on the front lines making that happen. Again, we have it easy. You and I here sitting there on a Zoom call with podcasts. People are out there fighting the fight. But I say that because I think the ability to adapt and respond to the environment is something that most people don't have. I've been using the concept lately, which you've probably heard of, which is, do you want to be a thermometer or a thermostat? So I have this in one of my presentations, actually the UX of You presentation, which I happily share with you on a sidebar. But the thermometer reads the temperature and simply reacts to the environment, versus the thermostat makes the environment respond to it. What I love about that is granted, we all need thermometers, we all need thermostats. Arguably, I say we don't all need thermometers because a thermostat has a thermometer built into it. So it's a little bit of a polymath joke that we can understand. But yeah, no, I think that's important. And I want to mention that because I think that the majority of the time that I failed and didn't continue was because I was reacting and not responding. And I think to your point, clearly my pillars were out of whack, right? If I had access to the Dustin Miller Guide to the Galaxy, you got to write that book, because I will happily, it'll be on that bookshelf. So get on that.
It's kind of interesting how you mentioned proactive versus reactive, because the second guest I had on the podcast is a well-being consultant, and Lee Chambers. And we were talking, like, basically the entire episode was talking about being proactive. And then,
send me a link to that. I'd love to check that out as I go for a run or something.
Being able to control your reactions to certain stimuli is very important. We were talking about earlier being a systematic thinker. And so growing up, especially with work as a lifeguard, I actually got in trouble a lot because I was a systematic thinker. I saw certain patterns evolving as, like, either just people in the pool doing things or certain teammates just not really being part of the cohesive whole team. There was just too many outliers, so to speak, and I was trying to get them all together, being more united. And so I tried certain endeavors to try to do that. And by being an outlier myself and doing so, I didn't understand people. I was being too reactive and not proactive. I wasn't getting my bosses involved. I wasn't getting certain other people involved that would be really helpful. And so it was lessons of, like, hey, be more proactive about the systematic thinking so that you can be more successful at doing it.
I want to offer a reframe on that. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing that vulnerability. I think your audience is going to get a lot of benefit from that, believe it or not, because I think the one thing that so many of us are just afraid to do is just admit the error of our ways, right? And it's this error of our ways that makes us better and stronger and evolves, right? But to that point, the reframe I want to offer you is, I don't think it was that you were proactive versus reactive. I think, one of my biggest leadership lessons was understanding that your intention, I learned this from my wife. Right. So if she listens to this, and I hope she does, she'll hear this, because I don't talk about her enough. And she's this, like, the truth be told, behind every great person or aspiring to be a great person, there's another great person. In this case, happens to be my wife. Doesn't always have to be a woman, but it's usually a woman that is the force that is behind all of us. Mothers, the best job and the most important job in the world. Right. And I look at this, and my wife said to me, she said, Pete, your intention and your impact do not line up. And what was interesting to me about that was your intention was to unify the group and to make sure no one got hurt or drowned in the pool or in the ocean or wherever you're lifeguarding. Your intention was amazing. It was pure. It came from a great place. But the impact you had was people thought you were being too logical or thought you weren't, whatever it was. But I struggle with that a lot myself, and I want to acknowledge that, because what I realized is, one of the best questions that I've been asking lately for people that trust me, and trust is so important. If you don't have trust, you have nothing. I've been asking the question lately is, like, how am I showing up for you? Mm-hmm. And one of the questions that really was just polarizing for me was when someone was like, you're showing up really aggressive. You're showing up really, like, angry. Mm-hmm. And I was like, fuck, like, excuse me, sorry for swearing. I'm showing up aggressively. How I wanted to show up was, like, passionately, like, well, you can do this. I know how talented you are. Like, let's come together. In this case, the lifeguards, let's come together. But because I didn't realize, I'm the CEO of this company, I'm the owner of this company, mm-hmm. I'm 6 feet tall and 230 pounds, right? I don't recognize that there's both a physical, a virtual, and a hierarchy power dynamic that exists simply from that. Like, think about this like this: when you're 100 episodes into this podcast, I don't know how many you're in right now, but let's just assume it's more than 100. I'm just going to assume that.
Halfway there.
What is it?
Halfway there.
Halfway there. Amazing. Great job, right? And get to that 100, right? Because episode 400 is going to be so much better than this episode, right? But here's the thing. Episode 400, there's some people that are going to listen to this right now or in the future or in the past, depending on how we look about that, right? Yeah. That are going to be afraid to approach you. Mm-hmm. They're not going to have the courage because they're going to be like, this guy, Dustin Miller, he's like Ray Kurzweil. He's got this incredible futurist podcast. So I think that lining up intention and impact are really important, and really leading with that intention. Like, one of the things I've been saying lately in meetings is, like, can we all just state what our intention is from this meeting? Yeah. And you can really tell just based on body language, what people are saying, like what it looks like. And for you to say, like, listen, one of the things I'm really trying hard to do is unify this group right now so that we can make sure that no one gets hurt. And I'm just trying to use all the tools that I have, but if you guys can help me understand a little bit more, I like that term, help me understand. I do that a lot. And I think it's a very disarming tool, mm-hmm. because what I found, Dustin, is we all say start with why. But when you ask someone the question of why, when you try to play 5 whys as it's designed in the textbook, if I say, like, well, why are you on this podcast? Why? It's disarming versus say, Dustin, do me a favor. help me understand these 4 pillars that you came up with, and how'd you come up with that? Versus I say, Dustin, why did you come up with 4 pillars? Or why did you come up with 4 pillars? You feel a bit challenged, like, well, it's insulting me. Exactly. Like, but help me understand those 4 pillars, and even just the body language. So that for me is something that I don't think it was you being proactive versus reactive, and maybe a little bit, but I think it was you had a pure intention that was misinterpreted. And that's something, again, I'm grateful for my wife for pointing that out to me, but there's no, I didn't have a course in business that said, emotional intelligence or these things. These things are being taught today in modern day curriculum, but I just think that there's so many important things: spirituality, emotional intelligence, self-awareness, creativity, experimentation, scientific method. If we just bundle all those things up and put them inside your courseware, which it might already be in there, right? For all I know, right? I'm going to dig into it now. Send me that syllabus. This is exciting. I find that I have a lot of these types of conversations with folks like yourself, but I think this one specifically stands out. Definitely send me a link when it's live, because I really want my team to listen to this, because I think that they're all going to get a ton of inspiration from you and the work you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your empathy in the whole, you had an empathetic analysis of that situation, that story I shared. And so once again, it was like coming down to that balance of science and just overall emotional intelligence dichotomy. And I think that's really kind of the beauty of leadership as well, because leaders need to understand the emotional intelligence, not only of themselves, but of others. And like you said too, reading the body language and watching for micro expressions, tonality, confidence. And once you're aware of that, you can become a better leader, or in this case, podcast host. One thing I've struggled with is active listening. I think that I've gotten better at it, and I set the intention from the get-go to make sure that I don't overly talk, because I am a talkative person, but I want to...
Guilty.
Yeah. But it's one of those things too, where what you were saying was so engaging. I didn't have any issues with active listening. And so once you set that intention, once you set that mindset of, hey, I want to work at this, I want to work at being a better leader, work at better being more proactive, I think that's really what's key.
No, I love that. And honestly, it's, again, you're wise behind your ears, and a lot, unless you've sort of unless you've transported your consciousness to a younger version of yourself, and you're actually 100 years old and just don't know it, because you're hiding in this sort of young person. I think the interesting thing is you're definitely wise behind your ears. I look back and I say, in my mind, I'm still 20 something, and I'm obviously, as you can see with the gray hair, I'm a lot older than that. But I think it's interesting is, while I would argue that my curiosity was always through the roof, I think one of the things that you talk about balance, and I love that, and I'm striving for that, is I find myself getting lost in my passion. Mm-hmm. When I get lost in my passion, and we see this with a lot of film directors or different people in creative fields, seemingly, or scientific fields, is they're often portrayed as these monsters because they're so into their craft, they sort of forget about the human expression and human existence. And I think, that to me is both inspiring but also terrifying, because for me, the act of getting into flow and being in that state of passion where I'll actually forget being in what I said or did, because I'm in this sort of zone, almost very butterfly effect, if you will. Yeah. Referring to the movie, not the chaos theory thing, but we can also go butterfly effect, and that's maybe next time. Yeah. But what's interesting there is when we're not present, I actually think that chaos ensues, and I firmly believe that sometimes that chaos creates opportunity. And where I'm personally struggling right now is finding enough balance to ensure that, to your point, I'm active listening enough. I'm creating inclusion with my team in a flat room that's balanced. But where I'm struggling, maybe you can give me some advice or give the audience some advice on this, is how do I take all the good that comes with that chaos? Because I firmly believe if I was to be totally present in some of those things, I haven't seen some of the levels of what Da Vinci referred to as the muse or the creative genius, the inspira, like the Greeks would say, right? Or the Italians in some cases. And I think that comes about, we look to about Van Gogh, with all the crazy things that these people have done as artists. Part of me thinks that there's a little bit of, you got to be a little bit crazy to be genius. And maybe I'm wrong there, but I'd love to hear your take. I mean, it sounds like this is something you've studied quite a bit and practiced. What shows up for you as a piece of advice?
My mind was racing. I was trying to shut it down so I can keep listening, but a few things to just right off the bat. Earlier today, one of the other persons on the podcast, Sean Shepard, he was talking about how entrepreneurs is basically a French word for crazy ones. And another thing to kind of mention as well is that Steve Jobs once said, it's the ones who are crazy enough to think that they could change the world are ones that often do.
Here's to the crazy ones. I've got the poster.
Yeah.
Love it.
And 2 resources. Let me see if I can find it right off the bat. 2 resources I might mention. There's a book by Paul Ekman. He's the leading person in microexpressions and this understanding body language. The show Lie to Me was based off of him, for example. He had a discussion with the Dalai Lama, which Buddhism itself has a lot of realms in compassion and emotional intelligence. And the dichotomy of the philosophy of Buddhism and the science of the body language and microexpressions really comes forth in that conversation because they're both open-minded enough to understand each other's viewpoints. So I think between that and the next research I mentioned, you're going to necessarily have like a very big boost in your overall ability to do so.
No, I like that.
Oh, yeah, thank you. The last thing was Wilson Melancelli. He is I want to say expert on flow. He's the only other person I've seen besides Mikhail.
Yeah, the creator of it. Yeah.
The creator of it.
Good luck pronouncing that one.
Yeah. Tchaikovsky, I think is what it was. But Wilson he's made courses and like books about flow. He has a lot of YouTube videos too. So he talks about a lot of the actual science behind it and trying to get into flow. And so if you can understand your own flow cycle and the way your brain works, which I guess sleep chronotype really goes into that as well. Your circadian rhythm is really important. Understanding your own flow so that you can optimize your life around that, which is also another reason why I did the 4 pillars, is that it's more about optimizing those pillars rather than really building them up.
Love that. Yeah, no, this is, I definitely got to nerd out on your content. This is some good stuff. I think you're bundling together a lot of really interesting things. And I think that as you continue to stack them with this knowledge and expression and experience, knowledge, expression, experience, I always talk about that stack, right? Mm-hmm. I think that you're going to start to see sort of have you ever studied emergence theory just as a concept?
A tiny bit, not enough.
I feel based at the most basic level, if you take the right mix of molecules, so in this case, hydrogen and oxygen, creates water if you combine it H2O, right?
Right.
The common emergence theories, you see things like, the caterpillar and the butterfly, just these ideas that things that you wouldn't expect to happen are, unconventional explosions of things, right? So I think that what's going to start to happen is the more that you develop this community of polymaths.
And innovators.
And innovators too, but I don't think you can be, I think the difference between a polymath and an innovator is action. Okay. And that's the delta for me. I use the delta symbol a lot. Is like most polymaths, you don't become a polymath without deeply delving into an eclectic set of subjects, right? So like when I think about like this idea of like, when I define polymath, which is something that I get asked to define all the time, like Pete, like why do you call yourself polymath? Like is that some like weird like sex thing that you're into? And it's like no. A deep passion for a multitude of seemingly unrelated subjects that when you interconnect them, that's how you go from linear to exponential progress in anything, whether it be knowledge, craft, expression, art, whatever the thing is, right? Mm-hmm. That's sort of like how I define it. So it's not an adjective that says I think I'm great. I've actually had people, behind my back insult me for using that term, but really like, when I came to grips with the fact that I was a polymath, I think I was reading some like Reddit thread, and it was like this one person's like, "Are you a polymath? Maybe you might be." And I was like, "What is this?" I dug into it. I'm like, "These are my people." Yeah. And obviously you're one of them. So I'm grateful for this conversation. You've definitely got my brain moving at 1,000,000 miles a minute. So
you already answered my final question: is what does a polymath mean to you? And so a couple things is that the brand that I created for myself that basically inspired the Polymath Polycast is PolyInnovator, which stands for being a polymath of innovation. And so I really do think that coming together between two intersections of skill knowledge is what's key to some really exponential innovations in the future. So before we go, I'll have all the links to your stuff in the description so people can find you. What is the call to action for the audience today?
The call to action that I would say for anyone watching this is believe in yourself because if you don't, nobody else who matters will. Now, keyword, I didn't say nobody else will. I said nobody else who matters will, if you don't believe in yourself. That's my call to action. You can preach curiosity, you can preach creativity, but what I've found is ultimately the only way to tap into those things is from the inside out. So believe in yourself, invest in yourself. And I'd love to stay connected with anybody that sees this now or in the future or in the past, depending on what you believe in.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you for being on the show. I'm glad to have you, and have a wonderful day to you innovators in the audience.
Awesome.